A few years back, I was working deliveries for UPS, assigned mostly to small towns and remote areas in North Carolina. The shift was usually uneventful, with most deliveries being routine, simple drop-offs at rural homes, cabins, and trailers. But one winter evening, I had a run that stuck with me ever since. It was my last delivery of the night, and it was already dark out when I pulled up the address on my GPS. The place was out in the middle of nowhere, past a couple of rickety old barns through a patch of woods that felt unnaturally silent. The road was barely more than a dirt path, the kind that kicks up a cloud behind you as you drive. By the time I reached the house, or trailer really, the air was heavy with that dense, earthy smell you get in deep woods. My headlights lit up the place, showing a rusted, beat-up trailer, paint peeling off its sides, sitting in a clearing with nothing but trees and darkness around it. There was no light on inside, no signs of life. Honestly, I wouldn't have been surprised if the place was abandoned. I grabbed the package, a small box, and made my way up to the trailer. The steps creaked under my weight, and I knocked on the door, waiting for someone to answer. After a long moment, I figured no one was home and was about to leave when I heard something, a faint shuffling inside, followed by a soft voice, barely more than a whisper. The door creaked open just a few inches, and an old woman peeked out, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide and unfocused. She mumbled something, her voice shaky and strange, almost like she was struggling to speak. "Can you help me with this?" she asked, motioning toward the package. I hesitated for a second, my instincts screaming at me that something was off, but I didn't want to be rude. So I nodded and stepped inside, following her into the trailer. The air inside was thick and musty, an overpowering smell of rot that hit me like a wave. My stomach churned as I tried not to breathe through my nose. The trailer was dark, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb at the end of a narrow hallway. The place was filthy, with piles of old newspapers, cardboard boxes, and random junk scattered all over the floor. As I followed her deeper into the trailer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every instinct told me to get out of there, but I kept moving forward, against my better judgment. The woman led me to a small room at the back of the trailer and asked me to leave the package in the closet. I stepped inside, the dim light barely illuminating the room. As I bent down to put the box on the floor, I noticed something, movement out of the corner of my eye. In the far corner of the room, just barely visible in the darkness, stood a figure. At first I thought it was just a coat hanging on a hook or a piece of furniture. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized it wasn't either of those things. It was a man, or at least I think it was a man. He was tall, unnaturally tall, his back hunched over slightly so that his head brushed the ceiling. His eyes were black, like deep, empty pits. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there watching me. A cold, creeping dread settled into my bones as I slowly backed out of the room, never taking my eyes off him. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I turned to the woman, about to ask who the hell the man was, but when I saw her face, her expression had changed. The wide, jittery look was gone, replaced with something far more sinister. Her lips twisted into a slow, unsettling grin, and her eyes gleamed with something dark, something malicious. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice low and rasping. "He's been waiting for you." That was it. I didn't stick around to find out what she meant. I bolted, practically throwing myself down the narrow hallway, slamming into the door as I rushed outside. I leapt into my truck, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the keys. As I sped away, I glanced back in the rearview mirror. The old woman was standing on the porch, her figure barely visible in the dark. And behind her, in the shadows of the trees, was that tall figure, still watching me, his black eyes gleaming in the night. I never went back to that town again. I told my boss the address was wrong and refused any route that even got close to that area. I still think about that night sometimes, wondering who or what that man was, and why, out of all people, he was waiting for me. I've been a trucker for over 10 years now, working for different companies and hauling everything from produce to furniture across state lines. About 3 years ago, I was driving shipments for a warehouse in Kansas. I remember this one cold Monday in February pretty well, because it was a night I'll never forget. It was around 3 p.m. when I started my shift, hoping to knock out the haul before it got too late. The weather was biting cold, with ice still lining parts of the highway. I had about 6 hours ahead of me, so I settled in and planned to push straight through to avoid pulling over for sleep. As the hours dragged on, I started getting that heavy-eyed feeling, you know the one, where your eyelids start drooping, and no matter how much you try to shake it off, it keeps creeping back in. I cranked up the heat to keep warm, but that only made me sleepier. It was almost midnight, and there was no one else on the road. The sky was pitch black, and the only light came from my truck's high beams. That's when I first saw him, just a shadow up ahead, standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was some deer or maybe a stranded motorist, but as I got closer, I could make out the figure of a man standing eerily still. I slammed on the brakes hard, sending the truck into a short skid before it came to a stop. The guy was standing just off center of the road, wearing all black. He had this weird long scarf wrapped around his neck, but it was his neck that really caught my attention. It was way too long. It didn't look human. His face, though, his face was blurry, like it wasn't fully there. It was as if the space where his features should have been was just wrong. I was about to roll down my window, maybe ask if he needed help, but before I could react, he turned his head slightly and dashed into the trees beside the road. It wasn't a normal run either. It was almost like he glided. My pulse was racing, but I shook it off and got the truck moving again. I told myself maybe I was just overtired, hallucinating from the long drive and lack of sleep, but the more I thought about it, the more it started to freak me out. I'd never seen anything like that before. About 10 minutes later, I was back up to cruising speed, doing about 5 over the limit, just wanting to reach my destination. That's when I saw something run across the road in front of me again. This time, I didn't even slow down. I just kept going. It looked like it was a person again, but I wasn't sure, and I wasn't stopping to find out. The rest of the drive was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. My eyes were burning from staring at the dark road, and I was starting to feel like I couldn't keep going. There was this little gravel pull-off spot a few miles up, so I decided to park the truck there and grab a short nap. I pulled in, cut the engine, and leaned my seat back, trying to calm my nerves. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by something. I couldn't tell what it was, but I felt uneasy, like something was wrong. My hand instinctively reached for the headlights, and when I flicked them on, I saw him. That same man, standing directly in front of the truck, just outside the reach of the headlights. His face, this time I could see it. He had the same long neck, the same black scarf, but now his face was twisted into this impossibly wide grin. His eyes were bulging out of his head, wide open, staring right at me through the windshield. I threw the truck into gear and sped out of there, gravel spraying behind me as the tires skidded on the rocks. I didn't stop until I reached the town, heart still pounding. I don't know how he got there. There's no way he could have covered that distance on foot. He was at least 10 miles back, and I was driving at full speed. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. I'd like to believe it was just a hallucination brought on by fatigue, but I've been on long hauls for years, and I've never experienced anything like that again. I'd been a trucker for about 6 years when this happened. It was mid-June, and I was hauling a load from Texas to Nevada. The route was long and mostly empty, just miles of desert highway stretching out in front of me, with nothing but sand, rocks, and the occasional distant mountain for company. The thing about driving at night on roads like that is how endless it feels. There's no horizon, just darkness all around, and it's easy to lose track of time. It was 11:30 p.m. when I first saw him. I was pushing 70, trying to make it to a truck stop I knew about before I hit my limit for driving hours. My high beams lit up the stretch of highway ahead, and that's when I spotted him, standing on the side of the road, arm outstretched, thumb pointing up. A hitchhiker. The guy looked odd from a distance, wearing what seemed like old, worn clothes, a long coat that didn't belong in the desert. I've always followed the unspoken rule: never pick up hitchhikers, especially in the middle of nowhere. But I slowed down to at least make sure he was okay. I was barely crawling at this point, and the hitchhiker was just staring straight at me, not blinking, just this intense, empty look in his eyes. I sped up. I didn't even think about stopping. In my rearview mirror, I saw him lower his arm, but he stayed standing there, watching me disappear down the road. I shook it off, chalking it up to being tired. After all, strange things happen when you've been on the road too long. I managed to make it to the truck stop about 30 minutes later. The place was small, just a few pumps and a diner. I parked the truck, got out, and stretched my legs. The air was cool, a slight breeze rustling through the scrub brush. I was still thinking about that guy on the road, wondering what his story was. Inside the diner, it was nearly empty. Just the waitress and a couple of locals sitting at the counter. I sat down and ordered some coffee, feeling the fatigue settle into my bones. The waitress brought it over, and we got to talking. She was friendly enough, asked me where I was heading, the usual small talk. But when I mentioned seeing the hitchhiker, her face went pale. "What did he look like?" she asked quietly. I described him, old clothes, long coat, that strange, vacant stare. She shook her head slowly, looking genuinely disturbed. "You're not the first to see him," she said. "Folks around here talk about a guy who's been hitchhiking along that road for years. Problem is, no one ever picks him up. And those who have, well, they've never come back." I felt a chill creep down my spine. I didn't really believe in ghost stories, but something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. I finished my coffee, left a tip, and headed back to the truck. The diner's lights flickered behind me as I climbed into the cab and locked the doors. The road ahead was long, but I kept thinking about what the waitress said. It had to be a local legend, one of those stories truckers share to spook each other. About an hour into the drive, there he was, standing on the side of the road once again. The hitchhiker didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with that same dead look in his eyes. But now he was smiling almost from ear to ear and just waving at me. I didn't know how to react to what I was seeing. But then, I blinked and he was gone. Just like that, he disappeared into the night. I looked around, out the windows, checked my mirrors. Nothing. The highway was empty. My heart was pounding in my chest, hands trembling on the wheel. I drove the rest of the way to Nevada without stopping, without thinking, just trying to get away from whatever the hell I had seen. By the time I arrived, the sun was coming up, and the whole thing felt like a bad dream. I parked in the receiving lot and climbed into the sleeper cab to get some rest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Later, when I checked my dash cam, the footage was corrupted. Static glitches, the works. But just before it cut out, there was a single frame of the hitchhiker standing on the side of the road, staring right into the camera. I've never driven that stretch of highway again, and I don't think I ever will.